So I was grabbing coffee last week with an old friend of mine. He's a senior project lead at one of the country's biggest infrastructure firms.
Right.
And for the first 20 minutes, he wasn't talking about, load-bearing capacities or supply chains, any of the stuff you'd expect.
No Gantt charts.
No Gantt charts.
Yeah.
He was, and I'm not exaggerating, he was practically glowing while showing me this new social impact matrix his department had just implemented.
The social impact matrix. Okay.
Yeah. He had this look of just profound, almost religious relief on his face. Yeah. He kept telling me how liberating it felt to finally move past what he called the tyranny of the spreadsheet.
The tyranny of the spreadsheet. I think I know where this is going.
Right. He kept insisting that for years, his industry had been, quote, trapped in a cold, meritocratic vacuum, and that this new framework was the long-awaited way to humanize engineering.
Humanize it.
But what really struck me was when I asked him, okay, so how are the actual construction timelines looking? He didn't pull up a chart. He didn't pull up any data.
What did he show you?
He started scrolling through a series of internal Slack screenshots, just these vividly colored infographics about narrative equity and, get this, the decolonization of the commute.
The decolonization of the commute. Wow.
He just whispered with this kind of giddy intensity, see, this is the real progress. He said the old metrics of efficiency are just relics of a power structure that's finally crumbling. To him, these digital badges, these infographics, were the ironclad proof that the project was a success.
Regardless of whether a single shovel had hit the dirt.
Exactly. But then the whole atmosphere just shifted.
Okay.
I pointed to a news notification on my phone. It was about a massive budget blowout and a 2-year delay on their flagship transit project, his project.
Reality intrudes.
And the man who had been so serene, so liberated just moments before, he underwent this instantaneous transformation. His face hardened, and he started this furious, almost rhythmic tirade.
Against the delays?
No, not against the delays. That's the thing. It was against the bad actors and the regressive elements who were even asking about the budget.
Of course. It's always the people asking the questions who are the problem.
And then he dropped this bizarre, just chilling line. He said, if we have to bankrupt the city to ensure the process is inclusive, then that is the price of justice.
That is something. Yeah. That's quite a statement.
That total disconnection, the switch from this blissful joy about the process to a snarling defense of objective catastrophic failure, it just left me stunned. This logic that it's better for a system to completely collapse while performing virtue than to just function while remaining neutral.
It's like watching a pilot celebrate the beautiful sunset while the altimeter is hitting zero.
That's it, exactly. It made me realize that his excitement wasn't about building anything at all. It was the quiet, terrifying satisfaction of a civilization that is, I think, finally giving up on reality.
That anecdote, I mean, that is a perfect distillation of the core inquiry we have to undertake today.
It feels like it's happening everywhere.
It is, and it highlights this fundamental escalating crisis that's born from the disconnection between objective reality, which, demands competence, efficiency, functional metrics, and this new morally derived definition of success.
A definition based purely on performance and ideology.
Precisely. So our deep dive mission today is really to unpack this dangerous new logic. We're going to trace this symptom from the corporate world, which you just described, through the collapsing social structure and all the way up to the geopolitical level.
And show how it all connects.
And show how the systematic erosion of meritocracy and competence is tied directly to this institutional shift. A shift where, as you saw, metrics of virtue are replacing metrics of function. This whole trajectory, our sources argue, it points toward the ultimate obsolescence of the centralized nation-state model itself.
Okay, that's a huge claim. So let's unpack it. We have to start where this ideological infection seems to have been institutionalized most effectively.
In the corporate world.
Exactly. Through these frameworks of ESG and what's called stakeholder capitalism, this really seems to be the engine driving this whole prioritization of perceived moral success over objective function.
That is the locus of the institutional change. You're right. Stakeholder capitalism, at its simplest, just suggests that a firm's long-term sustainability isn't only about maximizing shareholder profit.
Right. It's about all the stakeholders.
It's about ensuring responsiveness to all internal and external stakeholders, employees, the community, the environment, you name it, and ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance. That's the specific metric framework they use to judge that responsiveness.
And I think it's really important to understand that ESG didn't just appear out of nowhere as this monolithic political tool.
No, absolutely not. It's more complicated than that. Our sources identify 3 distinct and often competing forms of ESG that are operating within the corporate ecosystem right now.
Okay, can you tell me more about those 3 forms? Because I think the confusion around them is exactly what provides the cover for the most radical changes.
That's a great point. The first is what we might call McKinsey ESG.
The consulting firm version.
Exactly. It's a pragmatic, technocratic approach. It views ESG principles as simply a comprehensive risk management tool. It's useful for overcoming managerial inertia and, making long-term planning more robust.
So it's genuinely useful in some cases, like identifying climate risk to a supply chain or something.
Yes, it can be. It's about identifying blind spots. Then the second form is what's called corporate coordination ESG.
Okay.
This is where you see massive industry groups and global financial institutions trying to harmonize standards across the board.
So everyone's playing by the same rules.
In theory, it ensures that banks, insurers, large firms, they're all reporting data in similar ways, which ostensibly makes comparisons easier.
But there's a third form.
And this is the most disruptive one, activist ESG. This is where the framework is explicitly deployed to drive specific political and social outcomes, and it's often orchestrated by nonprofit advocacy groups.
So there's the political angle.
And the key insight here is that the first 2 forms, the pragmatic McKinsey one and the coordinating one, they provide this vast, neutral-seeming infrastructure.
A system that can be hijacked.
Exactly. It's an infrastructure that the activist ESG groups can easily hijack to enforce political mandates across entire sectors of the economy.
And the Bud Light debacle, which we all saw unfold in 2023, that stands as just the most striking example of what happens when these activist ESG priorities collide violently with the actual market.
It is the quintessential case study of this conflict.
It shows how the firm is forced to choose one master over the other.
It really does. I mean, the former marketing manager at the company openly stated that she viewed her position as a platform to be a social change agent.
She said that out loud.
Yes. So the marketing decision to partner with a trans influencer was, in her view, not a sales tactic. It wasn't about selling beer.
What was it about then?
It was an intentional effort to, and this is a quote, uplift working Americans into a proper view of trans folk as personages to be morally affirmed.
So they weren't selling a product to customers, they were re-educating them.
In essence, yeah. The sources argue that the corporate elite viewed their own customer base as this kind of human clay that needed to be molded into the proper ideological shape.
But the outcome was, objectively terrible from a business standpoint.
Take that.
Sales collapsed immediately. The stock price dropped significantly. It was a massive, undeniable rejection by their traditional customers.
Absolutely.
So why then did the CEO not issue a clear mea culpa to the alienated customers? That is business 101 for damage control.
Because under the new ESG framework, the CEO's decision becomes, believe it or not, rational.
Rational. Why?
It's rational, albeit according to a completely perverse metric. See, apologizing to the working class customer base might mitigate the immediate sales loss, sure.
It would stop the bleeding.
It would stop the bleeding, but it would signal to the activist ESG ecosystem that the company is retreating from its ideological commitments. And that move would risk damaging its critical ESG score.
Okay, so what are the real-world financial teeth behind that score? Why is an ESG score potentially more important than billions of dollars in lost sales? That's the part I think people don't get.
This is the core of the mechanism. The ESG score directly influences the entire corporate financial structure, the massive pools of capital controlled by institutional investors.
You're talking BlackRock, sovereign wealth funds.
BlackRock, big pension funds like CalPERS, exactly. They're increasingly mandated to allocate their resources based on ESG compliance.
So it's a gatekeeper for capital.
A powerful one. It creates a powerful enforcement mechanism. The sources suggest that a better ESG score can translate to approximately a 10% lower cost of capital for a major corporation.
10%, that's huge.
It's enormous. The perception of lower risk that's associated with having a strong license to operate in this new moral economy makes the firm more attractive to those giant pools of money.
So the CEO makes a moral retreat that lowers the ESG score.
The resulting increase in financing costs, the cost of their debt, the cost of their equity over the long term, could easily outweigh the temporary losses from a consumer boycott.
So in this system, Appeasing the ideological arbiters is the financially rational choice.
It is. Even if it completely infuriates your core customer base and tanks your sales, the long-term financial structure trumps short-term revenue.
And when you look at the mechanics of these scoring indices, particularly the CEI, the Corporate Equality Index,
which feeds heavily into the social aspect of ESG.
right, the analysis becomes deeply, deeply unsettling. Our sources discuss how firms can increase their CEI score by, for example, providing travel perks for activists or using preferred brand ambassadors.
Or appointing politically favored individuals to their boards.
Exactly.
And that's where the critics cited in the sources argue that the practice moves beyond mere corporate governance and begins to look like something else entirely.
Something more sinister.
When you have nonprofit advocacy groups dictating specific board appointments or how corporate resources are spent in exchange for a score that directly reduces a firm's cost of capital, it becomes very difficult to distinguish this setup from racketeering.
Racketeering.
The only difference, they argue, is its moral pretensions. The moralizing language is the necessary cover that justifies transferring corporate resources and power to these non-electoral ideological organizations.
So it gives these groups massive unelected power over corporate decision-making and ultimately where the money goes.
Exactly. It's a massive transfer of power.
So this isn't just about money. It's about institutional power being transferred using a moral rationale as the leverage point. And this institutional capture, driven by ESG and DEI, it seems to be fueled by a profound psychological shift in society.
It absolutely taps into a deeper societal hunger for purpose and meaning. We are, as the sources argue, living in a post-Christian society. The traditional narratives of meaning, of service, of responsibility, they fractured. And ESG and DEI provide a highly structured, monetizable, secular replacement for that.
A new religion, in a way.
A new religion with a clear catechism and, importantly, a clear path to salvation through compliance. And the output of this institutional capture is the emergence of a specific moral elite.
The people you mentioned earlier coming out of the universities.
Often graduates of what are described as highly dysfunctional universities, yes. This elite has replaced the historical notion of humble service, working to build or maintain a functioning society, with a view of themselves as cognitively and morally superior.
And this elite, holding all the correct ideological badges, views the general public with a profound condescension.
Precisely. They see the public, especially those who resist their ideological vision, not as co-citizens in a shared project,
but as what?
As human clay that needs to be sculpted into a better, more morally informed shape, or in harsher terms, as deplorables, who must be sidelined and silenced for the greater good of justice.
And that narcissism is the key. The performance of virtue, even if it leads to objective failure, like the infrastructure project in your story,
becomes the ultimate measure of success because the performer is morally elevated just by the attempt. The outcome is secondary to the intention.
And within this framework, certain social issues become culturally untouchable. They become holy causes that you can't critically analyze.
Right.
The sources focus heavily on how critical theory has placed trans issues in this specific position.
And what's fascinating is how the ideological framing provides the foundation for this cultural elevation. Critical theory frames traditional Western societies as fundamentally structures of oppressive constraints.
Okay.
So within this ideology, trans issues become the exemplar of radical liberation, the ultimate act of self-determination against what's framed as the imprisoning biology of cis heteronormativity.
So it's positioned as this sacred cause representing freedom from a foundational oppressive constraint.
Exactly. It's the final frontier of liberation.
And the economic alignment here is just perfect. Critics argue it's the first major civil rights campaign that is inherently and immediately monetizable. It creates a perpetual financial incentive for it to proliferate.
The economics are undeniable. Once a transition is initiated, it often involves hormone therapy, surgeries, specialized medical care that creates a continuous, lifelong revenue stream.
Right.
And beyond the direct medical monetization, the movement has fueled a multi-billion-dollar nonprofit advocacy economy.
That's a huge point.
The vacuum left by mainstream gay and lesbian groups, which, achieved many of their legal goals, was rapidly filled by activist groups focused on queer theory. And queer theory requires the maintenance of identity-based constraints and the pursuit of constant radical change.
So the design ensures the entire ecosystem is financially self-sustaining.
And perpetually incentivized to seek new ideological battles. There's no endpoint.
That deep structural failure in the corporate and ideological world, it perfectly sets the stage for the next massive problem we need to talk about. Because this retreat from objective functional competence is mirrored by the collapse of our fundamental social units.
Leading to sociological and sovereign breakdown.
Exactly.
If we follow this thread of atomization, the institutional crisis we've been discussing is really rooted in a societal one.
Which is?
The collapse of enduring family structures. We're talking about the dissolution of stable kinship models, whether they were the hunter-gatherer corporate families of the past or the industrial nuclear families of the mid-20th century.
And this is happening across the board.
The shift away from enduring marriage, particularly within the working class, is viewed by our sources as a catastrophe that much of the moral elite refuses to acknowledge.
Why not?
Because acknowledging it would challenge their core libertarian and individualistic worldview. It would mean admitting that constraints and traditions have value.
And the correlation data on this atomization and national structure is pretty striking. It suggests a really difficult trade-off at the heart of modern life.
It is a profound structural problem. We see a strong inverse correlation globally. Richer, more highly dynamic nations tend to have the smallest households.
Give me an example.
In places like Denmark and Finland, the average household size hovers around 2.7 people.
Okay.
Contrast that with poorer, more rooted nations like Gambia, where the average is 13.8 people per household.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is. Dynamic capitalism thrives on personal mobility and breaking old ties, which leads to atomization. But that same atomization creates immense societal wreckage.
When we talk about societal wreckage, what specific costs are being attributed, at least in part, to this fragile kinship structure?
The societal cost is immense, and it's accelerating. This fragile, detached, disconnected social structure, it contributes directly to the staggering rise of the opioid addiction crisis,
Right.
to soaring suicide rates, pervasive depression and anxiety, and a deepening inequality that can't be solved by just simple wealth transfers.
Because the underlying social fabric is gone.
When the basic safety net of an enduring family dissolves, individuals are left socially and psychologically unanchored. It makes them far more vulnerable to these compounding social crises. The social capital, the trust, the network, the shared knowledge, it just evaporates.
This leaves us with a deep paradox, then, that's inherent in contemporary Western culture. We seem to desire two things that are, on their face, mutually exclusive.
That is the tragic predicament. On one hand, society craves stability, close family units, the rootedness that provided psychological and financial resilience for centuries.
We want the good old days, in a sense.
We want the benefits of the good old days. But on the other hand, we fiercely champion radical individual mobility, dynamic, globalized capitalism, and the absolute liberty to adopt any lifestyle we choose.
And you can't have both.
The crucial self-destructive tension is that we want the social stability and the close families without the legal, cultural, and sociological constraints that made them possible in the first place.
We want the outcome without the inputs.
Exactly. We dismantled the constraints in the name of liberation, and now we're left with this fragile, distrustful wreckage where the replacement structures, like relying on transient friend groups, are proving to be a second-rate substitute at the societal level.
So if the social contract is dissolving at the micro level of the family, that failure has to ripple up to the highest level,
It does.
where the state itself is abandoning its most fundamental function, defining objective reality.
That is the sovereignty paradox. The state's basic mandate, going all the way back to the Hobbesian social contract, is to establish a shared reality, a single enforceable definition of fact in order to maintain order.
And when it stops doing that?
When the state systematically relinquishes this function and starts substituting objective facts for subjective ideological claims, it voids its own authority and its capacity to govern. It saws off the branch it's sitting on.
And this leads to specific instances of what you could call legal self-sabotage, where the rule of law is literally used to undermine objective reality.
The examples are chillingly clear right across the Western world. We saw the German Constitutional Court rule that a gender self-identity right supersedes the objective facts of biological sex.
So feelings trump facts, legally?
In Canada, you have the C-16 law, which established criminal consequences for misgendering. These are powerful, high-level legal actions that systematically replace biological reality with subjective identity claims.
And in the U.S.?
In the United States, the Homeland Security Department has signaled a shift in its enforcement priority away from focusing on illegal immigrant criminals toward prioritizing climate refugees.
Which is a profound redefinition.
It's a redefinition of the legal and factual basis of sovereignty itself, substituting a geopolitical reality with an ideological one.
And this ideological substitution, it leads directly to the dissolution of borders. It turns the sovereign line from a defensive barrier into an arena for moral performance.
That's a perfect way to put it. When a state can no longer confidently define what constitutes its own physical boundary or who possesses the right to cross it, the physical container of the civilization begins to dissolve.
Do we have examples of this?
Look at the UK's response to record illegal channel crossings. Instead of deploying hard measures, what did the Home Office do?
What do?
They issued an inclusive border management guide instructing staff to avoid using stigmatizing language like illegal.
So the problem isn't the illegal crossing, it's the word illegal.
Exactly. In Italy, during Mediterranean rescue operations, the government prioritized the special vulnerability of gender and sexual minorities in their protocols. The border ceases to be about national security or functional enforcement.
It becomes a venue for performing moral virtue.
And signaling ideological alignment. The system prioritizes the appearance of compassion over the functional necessity of sovereignty.
This self-dissolution of sovereignty has to have profound geopolitical implications for the so-called rules-based order that the West has relied upon since 1945.
The sources argue that the rules-based order, which was largely an architecture established by the U.S. for its own commercial and geostrategic benefit post-Bretton Woods.
Right. It wasn't a neutral thing.
Not at all. And it's rapidly collapsing into an illusion in today's multipolar world. When hard power tools like sanctions are wielded not for geostrategic leverage, but as a means of identity politics or moral performance,
their effectiveness just evaporates.
They become moral performance props.
I can see the connection. If the enforcement mechanism is based on a moral judgment that half the world doesn't share, rather than genuine capacity or strategic self-interest, other nations will simply ignore it.
And we have hard data demonstrating this collapse in effectiveness.
Let's hear it.
Consider the European Union. Their attempt at a 17th round of sanctions against Russia was internally blocked by its own Global Justice Working Group.
Blocked by themselves. Why?
To avoid increasing the inequality perception in the Global South.
You're kidding me.
The ideological commitment to global justice paralyzed the geopolitical tool that was designed to exert influence.
Unbelievable.
Meanwhile, the U.S., which once meticulously crafted justifications for its contentious global actions, has, according to critics, become a lot more brazen.
What does that look like?
Our sources note instances where U.S. agencies, when confronted with uncomfortable human rights reports, responded with glib dismissals, essentially saying, "We decide the truth and we aren't reading your report."
So a total disregard for the process.
This brazenness signals a foundational disregard for the international rules the U.S. supposedly enforces, which further delegitimizes the entire order.
And the economic shifts are maybe the clearest signal that the foundational U.S. hegemony, which underpinned that order, is eroding at a rapid pace.
The evidence of de-dollarization is stark. The U.S. dollar's share in BRICS trade settlement has dropped dramatically. It went from around 85% in 2015 to an estimated 28% in 2025.
28%. That's a collapse.
And these countries are actively building parallel financial infrastructure. Concurrently, non-Western military cooperation agreements have surged by 340% in just the last 5 years.
So they're building their own systems completely outside the Western framework.
Completely. And what's more, the sanctions are demonstrating negative marginal utility. Russia's economy, the target of unprecedented sanctions, grew by 2.3% in 2025, according to forecasts.
And the sanctioning countries?
The German economy, a leading sanctioning power, contracted by 1.2%. Moral pronouncements without economic and military enforcement capacity are proving to be strategically self-defeating.
This all brings us to an inevitable and, frankly, terrifying conclusion.
Yeah.
The nation-state, this central organizing principle of the modern world, is functionally obsolete as a governance technology.
That's the critical conclusion our sources point to. We often forget that the modern nation-state is a relatively recent invention. It's only about 380 years old. a human invention born out of the 1648 Peace of Westphalia.
And it was designed for a very specific purpose.
To solve one specific devastating problem in Northern Europe, how to contain these interminable, brutal conflicts over religion and ideology by establishing state sovereignty.
And yet this operating system seems to have a profound, dangerous flaw baked into its very foundation.
The flaw is that while it theoretically contained religious wars, it has utterly failed to prevent even more destructive conflicts. The Napoleonic Wars, 2 world wars.
And it gets worse.
More critically, when post-Westphalian colonial powers imposed these artificial borders globally, they did so with complete indifference to previous tribal boundaries and conflicts. This act of centralizing diverse, often antagonistic groups within artificial lines has often magnified rather than contained violence.
And the Rwandan genocide, which resulted in nearly 1 million deaths in 100 days, is just a chilling example of what happens when that artificial constraint fails catastrophically.
It serves as a profound illustration of the tragedy of centralized artificial borders. You had the Hutu and Tutsi tribes with distinct histories, kettled together within the boundaries of a single nation-state, drawn arbitrarily by colonial European powers.
And that created the structure for the genocide.
This imposed centralization created the structure that allowed one group to systematically lord power over the other, which led to the eruption of mass murder and sexual violence.
And the core question is?
The core question posed by the sources is whether such a horrific event would have occurred on that scale without the imposed artificial constraints of that centralized Westphalian boundary. Far from preventing atrocities, the centralization of power often makes the problem worse.
And beyond this kind of existential violence, the state has consistently failed at one of its most basic mandates of governance, maintaining monetary integrity.
The monetary failure of the nation-state is relentless. They have made hyperinflation common worldwide, and the sheer instability of fiat currency is astonishing.
How bad is it?
The average lifespan for a pure fiat currency, according to historical analysis, is a mere 27 years.
27 years, that's it.
That's it. Even the seemingly modest target inflation rates of 2% mean that family wealth held in that national currency is essentially wiped out within a single century.
So what is the core mechanism that makes this debasement inevitable under the centralized nation-state model?
Centralization is the political cover. Nation-states rely on debasing their currency on printing money, rather than levying new, politically challenging taxes.
It's the easy way out.
It's a mechanism to gradually siphon away the wealth of the citizenry without an immediate revolt. As the economist Lynn Alden noted, nation-states, having control over their currency, feel free to just print money to avoid immediate economic or political problems.
And this points to the core problem.
Centralization acts as an absolute magnet for corrupt individuals. The famous bank robber, Willie Sutton, was often quoted as saying he robbed banks because that is where the money is.
Right.
The deeper truth is that the money is in the central authority controlling the economic organization. That is where corruption naturally concentrates.
And we see this endemic corruption in all centralized structures, not just governments, but in the largest private institutions that coordinate with them, like JP Chase.
JP Chase provides a stark illustration of this institutional rot. Since 2003, the company has incurred over 80 regulatory fines.
How much?
Totaling a staggering $39 billion. But the mechanism of obscuring the abuse is what's most critical. In one instance, the SEC had to file a cease and desist order because the bank had deleted 47 million electronic communications.
47 million. So they just erased the evidence.
Effectively making records inaccessible to investigators. When the system is centralized and non-transparent, it becomes the particularly apt agent for what are known as illicit financial flows, or IFFs.
Meaning, the drug cartels, terrorists, and organized criminals aren't necessarily relying on niche, decentralized methods.
No, they're capturing the legacy centralized system.
The central authorities are, in effect, the best friend of criminals.
Because they provide the necessary opacity and scale. Drug cartels, for instance, they capture local Mexican governments not by starting their own currency, but by leveraging the centralized municipal structures.
How does that work?
They do this by having local businesses pay taxes as fees directly to the cartels through the centralized town municipalities, which then pass the money on to the cartel leadership.
So the government structure becomes a money laundering machine.
The centralized governance structure provides the perfect high-volume cover for money laundering and illicit financial flows. It hides the dark money behind closed, unauditable doors.
So while this nation-state model is failing, and its core institutions are being captured, we're also seeing what's been called a Cambrian explosion of alternative governance models. Sovereignty is being lost both upwards and downwards.
That explosion is fundamentally reshaping the governance landscape. Sovereignty is being ceded upwards to, transnational constitutionalism and the European Union or international courts.
And downwards.
And it's fragmenting downwards into smaller specialized units. But the most dramatic alternatives often come from non-state actors operating across borders, effectively filling the vacuum left by state failure.
And the cartels we just mentioned are a prime example, often acting as de facto governing authorities.
They absolutely are. Take the case of Nazario Moreno Gonzalez. He was the leader of La Familia Michoacana, which later became the Knights Templar cartel.
Okay.
Gonzalez was a major narcotics trafficker, yet he simultaneously ran a highly effective evangelical Christian mission.
A trafficker and a missionary.
His organization provided loans to farmers, funded local schools and churches, and distributed aid to the poor. He was effectively providing the social services the official, corrupted Mexican government could not deliver.
So he was the state, for all intents and purposes.
He even issued a spiritual manual for his followers, emphasizing virtues like humility and service. When he died, he was venerated as a folk saint, San Nazario. It shows that where the state fails to provide effective governance, other actors, often criminal ones, will step in and create new, functionally centralized systems to meet local needs.
Now, what about the fragmentation downwards? The local governance units referred to as the dark continent of American politics, the HOAs and special taxing districts.
These are the local government shards. As far back as the early 1980s, Florida alone had thousands of special taxing districts, significantly outnumbering its cities and counties combined.
But the key takeaway here is that just breaking up a large centralized power into smaller pieces.
What's called sharding.
Right, sharding. That doesn't eliminate the corruption problem if the organizational structure itself remains centralized.
That's the crucial point. A centralized HOA is just as opaque and just as much a magnet for corruption as a centralized state bureaucracy, just on a smaller scale.
So if we move from one centralized power to 10,000 smaller centralized powers, we've just created 10,000 new tempting targets for local corruption.
Precisely. The Hammocks Community Association scandal in Florida illustrates this perfectly. A centralized organization with local money and a total lack of transparency led to predictable abuses, including the leadership just discarding 2/3 of the ballots during a crucial vote.
And these local failures are often invisible, which is where the term dark continent comes from.
Exactly.
We also saw the tension when the legacy political system decides a shard of governance has become too powerful or ideologically inconvenient, like with the Disney versus DeSantis dispute.
The state will tolerate local governance only up to the point where it clashes with central political or ideological interests. Disney had essentially been a local governing authority through its special taxing district for decades. But when the corporation's ideological stances clashed with the governor's office, the state instantly intervened to reclaim sovereignty.
So the lesson is, legacy governments are happy for smaller forms of government to perform necessary functions like fixing roads.
But they will never willingly relinquish the element of control necessary to protect their major donors or to enforce their preferred ideological positions. Centralization, even in a small shard, makes it easier for external forces to capture or manipulate it.
Okay, so this entire analysis of endemic, centralized corruption, from global banks deleting millions of records to a local HOA throwing out ballots, it makes the shift to genuinely decentralized alternatives seem not just appealing, but technologically inevitable.
It does.
And the conceptual and technical path forward was laid out by two groups, the cypherpunks and the hacktivists.
These groups, working on the digital cutting edge in the late 20th century, laid the foundation for a post-Westphalian order. The cypherpunks focused on the importance of individual privacy. They developed cryptographic tools to secure it, arguing that only code could enforce rights in the digital age.
And the hacktivists.
Simultaneously, hacktivist groups prioritized governmental transparency. They developed tools to pierce veils of secrecy maintained by centralized powers.
And they demonstrated that political action could unfold orthogonally to physical borders, creating a new, distinct cyberspace that needs its own institutions.
Absolutely. Think of the wankworm worms against nuclear killers that hit NASA computers in 1989, right before the launch of the Galileo probe.
Right.
It was digital protest. It proved that activism could function through communication and digital modification of existing technologies. Later, WikiLeaks provided a massive look behind the curtains into the state's actions, demonstrating that new non-state architectures could force transparency.
So these movements prove that new lines of communication were emerging,
Right.
bypassing traditional state boundaries and laying the conceptual groundwork for decentralized law.
Exactly.
The technical necessity for a new architecture begins with fixing the most fragile aspect of centralized power: the archive. The archive is the DNA of any government, yet it's historically so vulnerable.
History shows us that control of the archive is control of the narrative. Political power, as Derrida noted, rests on the ability to control and maintain the historical record.
And those records get destroyed.
Routinely. By revolutionaries, warlords, fire, corrupt record keepers, from debt records during the Mexican Revolution to the burning of 27 Mayan codices by the Bishop of Yucatan in the 16th century. If the records can be destroyed, the government can lie about its past and its debt.
And even centralized computer databases are just a single point of failure.
A very fragile single point of failure.
That's where blockchain technology offers a radical solution for durability and corruption resistance.
Blockchain offers durable, corruption-resistant, transparent archives through the mechanism of Byzantine fault tolerance.
Can you explain that in simple terms?
Imagine a large group of generals trying to coordinate an attack, but they don't have a central messenger, and they know some of them might be traitors. Byzantine fault tolerance is a system that ensures that even if a significant percentage of nodes or generals are malicious or fail, the honest majority can still achieve consensus and ensure the data's integrity.
So by distributing the ledger across numerous nodes globally,
You eliminate the single point of failure that centralized databases present. The records become secured, visible to all, and tamper-proof.
but radical transparency can conflict with the need for privacy, especially in government operations, national security, or proprietary business dealings. How does the technology reconcile the need for public auditing with confidentiality?
This is where the mathematical innovation of zero-knowledge proofs, specifically ZK snarks, becomes absolutely essential. It's a powerful tool for accountability.
How does it work?
Think of it this way. A ZK snark allows you to mathematically prove a statement is true. For instance, that you meet a required financial threshold without revealing the underlying proprietary information itself, like your actual bank balance.
So you can prove something without showing your work.
Exactly. In a governance context, this allows a community to verify that the state has committed a required percentage of resources to a social cause, without revealing the state's proprietary or sensitive financial breakdown. It allows for transparent accountability while maintaining necessary confidentiality.
Okay, so the technical foundation of immutable, auditable archives leads us directly to the automation of governance itself, which fulfills a vision dating back centuries.
The conceptual groundwork for automated governance is ancient. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, back in 1666, proposed a formal universal language where the correct action for the government might be computed by algorithmic proofs.
But he didn't have the tech.
He didn't have the tech. The advent of computing and Nick Szabo's invention of smart contracts finally provided the technological platform to realize this vision centuries later.
And smart contracts are the key, because they don't just guide the action of the sovereign, they execute it automatically.
Precisely. A smart contract is a self-executing contract, where the terms are directly encoded as a computer program deployed on the blockchain. The execution of governance policies can be automated, made visible, auditable by all, and guaranteed to execute once specified conditions are met.
So if an entire process, from citizens voting on a new environmental regulation to the mandated execution of a tax change, is built into smart contracts.
There is no reliance on corrupt politicians to follow through on their campaign promises. The contract executes automatically. The promise is the execution.
And this capability makes decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, the crucial tool for implementing this post-Westphalian automated order.
DAOs are the organizational structure that houses the smart contracts. They are the transparent, auditable entities of the future, and their structural integrity was proven during the 2022 crypto crisis.
How so?
While centralized exchanges like Sam Bankman-Fried's FTX collapsed catastrophically because their operations were completely opaque, no one could audit where the customer money went.
Right.
DAOs like MakerDAO survived and functioned precisely because Their operations, their assets, their liabilities were transparent and auditable on-chain by anyone in the world.
So the transparency requirement is what separates the resilient from the fundamentally corruptible.
It is the ultimate antidote to centralized corruption. The DAO structure allows communities to align governance tokens with desired behaviors, rewarding genuine community contributions, and, most importantly, ensuring that elected policies are automatically instituted.
So the systemic problem of centralized corruption, whether it's a major bank deleting 47 million records or a local HOA discarding ballots,
is fundamentally solved by placing the rules, the books, and the mechanism of action on an immutable, globally auditable ledger.
This sounds almost utopian. But we established earlier that nothing is 100% trustless or perfectly decentralized. Governance always bottoms out with human beings. So where are the conceptual limits of this decentralized approach?
We have to be very clear about this. Blockchain governance is not a perfect technological utopia. We still face the problem of social centralization. Founders and charismatic figures, a new oligarchy, if you will, still hold enormous sway. A figure like Vitalik Buterin, the co-founder of Ethereum, still holds massive indirect influence over the project's direction simply by virtue of his insight and ability to propose ideas, even without any direct governance control.
So if we are simply replacing the old opaque oligarchy with a new crypto oligarchy, what's the fundamental tangible benefit for the average person?
The difference is radical accountability and frictionlessness. The interests of this new elite are demonstrably better aligned with the community.
How can we know that?
Because their actions, their contracts, and their resources are entirely transparent and auditable on-chain. If they deviate or act selfishly, the entire community knows instantly, and the technology allows for immediate, transparent challenge and correction.
And the path to power is different.
Furthermore, the pathway to power within these new organizations is described by observers as being more frictionless and more merit-based than legacy systems, which rely so heavily on inherited wealth, political connections, and opaque backroom deals. The old system required opacity to survive. The new one thrives on transparency.
That brings us to the critical requirement for sustainability. The core values needed to maintain this technological stack and prevent a descent back into centralized corruption.
This requires adhering to what the sources call level 2 values that sustain the entire system.
And what are they?
They are radical transparency, the right to exit, and the continuous pursuit of decentralization. If the culture supporting the technology fails to uphold these, the technology stack itself will eventually fail and centralize again.
The right to exit seems paramount in escaping the obsolete failures of the Westphalian order, which, as you said, often trapped and kettled people together under duress, like in the Rwanda example.
Exit is the ultimate check on tyranny. If you cannot exit a system, you can be oppressed by it. But for the right to exit to be meaningful, citizens must have access to knowledge of alternatives.
They have to know there's somewhere else to go.
Knowledge that new, different forms of social and political organization exist and are functioning. This is why the cultural constraint we discussed at the start, the need for virtue signaling and forced ideological alignment, becomes fundamentally unacceptable.
Because it blocks knowledge of alternatives.
Any culture that requires involuntary censorship and forced ignorance to survive is not worth preserving. Because if the right to knowledge of alternatives is forfeited, the right to exit is fundamentally undermined.
The quiet satisfaction of celebrating a process while the underlying system collapses, that joy and subsequent snarling defense that my infrastructure friend showed, is the inevitable result of centralized governance structures, prioritizing opacity and performative morality over objective function.
That performative morality is a necessary cover only because the institutions are fundamentally corrupted by the secrecy and power afforded by centralization. The solution to the scourge of centralized corruption, from global banks moving dark money to local HOAs discarding ballots, is not a new layer of central regulation.
Which history shows is easily captured anyway.
Exactly. The solution is the radical, persistent light of decentralized transparency. We have to tear down the curtains and kick down the doors of the smoke-filled rooms using this light.
And blockchain technologies provide that light. They offer a substantially more friction-free and, frankly, bloodless platform to attempt new social and political orders, unburdened by the geographical constraints and the fundamental flaws of the 380-year-old Westphalian model.
It is not a utopian fantasy. It is an inevitable technological path. By leveraging immutable archives, smart contracts, and genuinely decentralized organizations, we can achieve better self-sovereign governance. We have nothing to lose but the tyranny of centralized governance, its endemic corruption, and all of its barbed wire fences.